Välkomna till Elpidadagen och EU-dagen mot människohandel den 18 oktober 2024. Elpida fyllde 7 år igår och med oss idag så har vi Marcel van der Watt från NCOSE, National Center on Sexual Exploitation i USA. Marcel är tidigare polis och har också studerat det här med prostitution och sexköp ur akademiskt perspektiv. Och den här diskussionen, föreläsningen kommer att vara på engelska. Elikkä tervetuloa tänään Elpidapäivälle. Elpida täytti eilen 7 vuotta ja tänään on myös EUn ihmiskaupan vastainen päivä. Meillä on mukanamme tänään Marcel van der Watt NCOSEsta, National Center on Sexual Exploitation Yhdysvalloista. Tulemme puhumaan seksityöstä ja prostituutiosta akateemisesta perspektiivistä ja puhumme tänään vain englantia. Very welcome, Marcel, and I'll give the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katarina, and thank you for this opportunity to just join you on this call. You know, we had about 3 or 4 minutes together having a conversation before we went live, and I'm just deeply grateful for your work and your perspective and just your sincere concern for, you know, what you are dealing with, what you are seeing, and just just your search for evidence and insights to really help those that are in the midst of this very harmful industry. So thank you for that, or rather, let me say a system, right? A system of exploitation and prostitution. I'm just gonna share my screen, and can you see my screen, Katarina?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, wonderful. Let me just quickly do this. Okay. So again, I think what I'll be just touching on briefly is just some of the concerns that you know, that we as an organization, as individual kind of subject matter experts at NCOSE, but also, you know, me as a former law enforcement officer, you know, that I see in prostitution research. And what we so often see is a massive, I can't overstate this, a massive disconnect between what's happening in the real world out there in real life in terms of prostitution and the system of prostitution and its inextricable link with sex trafficking, and what we see in academic studies. You know, so often, I mean, over the years, I've, you know, previously as a frontline police investigator, you know, you read a study or you listen to commentary on the TV or the radio, which really comes down to normalizing the idea of prostitution, normalizing it through the use of terms like, and I'm using this in quotes, sex work, etc. And then you cannot but wonder how much time are these researchers or commentators actually spending in the system that's vastly dislodged from the real world, you know, the research dislodged from the real world. So I think you know, the presentation is just really a few kind of insights, just some of the things that I've personally learned over the last 22 years, and obviously also what some of the research we have done and kind of distilled from studies. So I've just kind of entitled it "Concerns in Prostitution Research," and that's really a understatement, referring to it as merely concerns. So I think the first thing, you know, why should we care about research and what is clearly a you know, huge problems in prostitution research? Well, firstly, you know, biased research enables, it constructs, and it then reinforces a cultural and a legal environment that's conducive for sexual exploitation of children and adults in the commercial sex trade. So off the bat, I'm just going to make this statement that sometimes, again, coming back to these studies, you know, you cannot but infer that it's almost like the findings comes first, and then you find the scholars trying to find the evidence to support the findings. You know, it's almost like shooting a flaming arrow at a blank wall and then walking towards the wall and the arrow and then drawing a circle around that and saying, see, you know, we hit the mark. And you know, so many times, like the methodologies and how the decision making progressed through the study, you know, from sampling to the lack of ethical considerations, truncation of definitions, and then into findings that makes these broad stroke statements. Well, we need to legalize or decriminalize the sex trade. It's really dizzying, and I think so much of the problems in research kind of, you know, just goes over the heads of so many policymakers and politicians and decision makers, because so many of these key people just simply don't have the time to read and to critically assess what is being proffered or shared with them. So we should really be concerned about, you know, just problematic research, generally speaking. So, you know, just some of the things you know, we've done a few studies and come up with a few fact sheets, but there's one thing that one output that we are currently busy with. We're actually writing up a report on prostitution research flaws, and we hope that that will be released, if not in December, latest January or February. So we would love to share that with you. But basically, some of the things that we've come across you know, from a thematic perspective, are, you know, that little image right at the bottom there. And these are thematic issues that runs through so many of the studies. Is firstly, there are foundational methodological flaws in some of these studies. There's also unashamedly harm rationalization and the obfuscation of harms, you know. What Reem El-Salem, the special rapporteur on violence against women and children, referred to as the weaponization of consent. That's kind of the harm rationalization part. And then there's also the breach of ethics, you know, in terms of, and we'll go into one or two of those examples, but, you know, just, you know, we all know those in the system of prostitution. There's a lot of acute vulnerabilities, whether it's drug addiction or poverty or just psychological complex trauma that from the outset should raise red flags when we just sample a group of people with all of those indicators, and we do these studies where we ask questions, and often we come up with the interpretation of their experiences. It's horrific to see what is actually been documented in several of these studies over the years. But then also there is this thread that runs through it. There is a overtly an anti-trafficking bias. So you will also often find that people who proffer the idea of full decrim or legalizing what they call sex work, there is implicit in that is a very, very strong antagonism and even hostility towards the notion and the reality of sex trafficking, human trafficking, that's implicit in the sex trade. And the reason for that is once you acknowledge that sex trafficking is inextricably linked with prostitution, your arguments to fully decriminalize and to normalize sex buying, it falls to the ground. So there is this this built-in retort against the concerns expressed around the issue of sex trafficking, because by acknowledging it, your arguments to decriminalize sex trade kind of falls into pieces. And then there's also a very real theme of funding these research and policy agendas. A lot of money from a lot of very prominent individuals and organizations, and we've documented this. I'm not going to go into that right now. We will be releasing that probably in the next few months. But another thing that we see in research is, oftentimes, and you hear this in policy discussions where groups would say, well, don't conflate sex work and human trafficking. So basically what they are saying, these are two separate issues. You can't, don't talk about human trafficking and in the same conversation speak about prostitution. They are two separate issues. And that is one of the consistent arrows in this quiver of arguments, is that these are two separate things. You cannot conflate them. Well, research, evidence-based research, court cases that's been documented, over many years, and we'll go briefly into that as well, tell us a vastly different story. I can tell you, as a police official that has done work in countless brothels in South Africa specifically, but I've done work in the sex trade elsewhere in the world, amongst others, Nepal, Pattaya, Thailand, Mozambique. There's just this coherency that it's impossible to delineate between these two. And another thing that's impossible is to delineate and distinguish, and in fact, it's futile to distinguish between men's demand for commercial sex and men's demand for sex trafficking. It's impossible to delineate between those two. We've seen that also in a fairly recent German study by Melissa Farley and some of her colleagues, that found that I think less than 1% or 1% of men report seeing trafficking. So they see trafficking. Less than 1% of those men who purchase sexual access to women will report that, and this is in the German sex trade. So frankly, it's futile. It's impossible to delineate between men's demand for prostitution or just commercial sex or sex work, as some would say it, and the men's demand for trafficking. But so this is one of those arguments. So I think we should hold the line that sex trafficking, prostitution is inextricably linked. I'm not going to go too much into international law, but the Palermo Protocol is very, very clear that that implicit in the Palermo Protocol, the letter and the spirit of the protocol acknowledges the inherent harms of prostitution and calls on countries to discourage the demand that fosters sex trafficking. It's very clear. It's international law. So every country, at least, that has ratified the Palermo Protocol, kind of the landmark international treaty, there is a host of international legal and political commitments that countries have to discourage demand. This is not a thumbs up. This is not us saying, well, we are abolitionists and we don't think men should purchase sexual access to women. No, this is international law. This should be domesticated in your local international pieces of legislation. And for some bizarre reason, if your police service or your police force say, well, we're not going to go after sex buyers, well, frankly, then that is antithetical to to international law, international human rights law. You should be going after those who purchase sexual access to women and children. In fact, you have a legal duty to do that. I would strongly make that argument, and it is in line with international law. Just another thing that is also important in terms of law. Many of you may be familiar with the idea of abuse of a position of vulnerability in the Palermo Protocol. you know, this is one of the means that leads to, you know, it's where a position of vulnerability is abused. Not all countries have this definition deconstructed. This is one example from South Africa, which I think it's a great example, but this just gives you some insight in terms of how ridiculous some of these arguments to normalize sex work, as they call it, or prostitution is. So, and this definition is totally aligned and coherent with international law principles. So here, what you could argue abuse of vulnerability is any abuse that leads a person to believe that he or she has no reasonable alternative but to submit to exploitation, and includes, but is not limited to, taking advantage of the vulnerability of that person, resulting from a person, you know, entering a country being illegal or without proper documentation, pregnancy, disability, addiction to drugs, being a child, social circumstances, or economic circumstances. So if you think about this definition of abuse of vulnerability as one of the key elements in the definition of trafficking, you cannot but see, I would argue, the overwhelming majority of people in prostitution has a combination or even all of these factors that makes them acutely vulnerable. And so often you do have third parties, pimps, traffickers that steps in and then abuses this vulnerability. And this again also just gives us some insight in terms of how the abuse of vulnerability is implicit in the system of prostitution and is inextricably linked with sex trafficking. I'm not going to go into too much of this, but I just want to share some of these statements that is, again, entirely incongruent with the definition of trafficking in persons, international law, but also domestic law. Most domestic laws in the world will not, is incongruent with some of these descriptions. So here you've got researchers that would argue women are not deceived and coerced, but know perfectly well, let me just see it, perfectly well, that their work will be exploitative, but this falls short of trafficking. This is entirely incongruent with the definition of trafficking. Now, a lot of these authors that I'm quoting here are also what they call pro-sex work or preservationist researchers. So there is this cunning way of truncating the definition of trafficking and coming up with a new definition that has no basis in domestic and international law. Here's another definition. The majority of sex worker respondents hold the understanding that human trafficking is some form of exploitation linked to movement. That's another very, very, you know, a cunning tactic that's being used to say, well, you know, these people, these women weren't moved, and therefore it's not trafficking. There's always this movement component to trafficking. So they would go to parliament, they would go to policymakers, and they say, well, you know, we are for the rights of sex workers, and these sex workers, they work within this specific city. Yes, there's harm and there's some form of exploitation, but it's not human trafficking because they only work in this little city. Again, that's entirely incongruent with the definition of human trafficking. Movement is not a prerequisite for trafficking to happen. In fact, trafficking can happen in one street. Trafficking can happen in one neighborhood. I worked a specific case just as an example. And again, this is aligned with international law. One example, one trafficker took his trafficking victim on a weekly basis to go and visit her parents over a breakfast, during a breakfast on a Sunday morning. After the parents came from church, the trafficker would take the victim to a little restaurant called Wimpy in South Africa. And they would all have breakfast together. After they leave, the woman is being exploited again. And again, pretty much happened in a street. The wimpy was about 2 kilometers away from where the woman was exploited, and again, no movement there. But again, it's so important to understand and to make sure that definitions is your North Star, and then whatever people claim, whatever research says, is aligned with those definitions. If it's not, then there's red flags that should be raised here. Also, just another thing that we see in studies. I mean, here's one example where researchers has done studies with, look at this, women's entry both before and over 18. Now, remember, this is a peer-reviewed study, right? Look at all of those authors. These are mostly PhDs, and then this is the language that they use, while avoiding a simplistic narrative of female sex workers who entered before the age of 18, being forced into trading sex. It was notable that 1/5 of all female sex workers who started as under 18 also experienced conditions of force, fraud, coercion, or deceptions at entry compared to, and then they at the end there, it should say it should, however, be emphasized that most women in this cohort did not meet the criteria for being trafficked. The point is, in international law, and specifically here in America, if you are exploited or if you are used in prostitution or prostituted as a child under the age of 18, you are implicitly a trafficking victim. So what we see with a lot of these studies is they almost depict teens and even youth under 18, and they put them in the same category as adult people who are who kind of reconcile themselves with these harms in the sex trade. It's entirely incongruent with international law. These are actual trafficking cases. But pro-sex work researchers will come and they will argue, no, that's not trafficking. You know, the person reconciled themselves with the harm. They are there out of their own volition. They had freedom of movement, and therefore these are not trafficking cases. All of the above, all of these issues are entirely incongruent with definitions. And I think we should all be looking out for those. Katerina, I will also be sharing with you these fact sheets that we've done that really clearly lays out 10 reasons to oppose full decriminalization of prostitution, and the other one, why sex buyers must be stopped and how to do it. So these are really useful tools that really just dispels any notion that prostitution should be normalized and that it is a harm reduction method to decriminalize prostitution. I spoke at the UN about 2 years ago, and I just made this unequivocal statement. I say, no. The, full decriminalization is not a harm reduction method. It's a harm production method. It's totally antithetical to the idea of harm reduction. You actually produce harm by legalizing or decriminalizing the sex trade. And I think what is really important to understand for police officials in Finland, police officials all over the world, is that sex buyers is the critical missing link in stopping trafficking. They are literally the primary driving force. These acute vulnerabilities that we often see in the sex trade, marginalized communities that ends up in the sex trade, they are there because men, sex purchasers, pounce on these acute vulnerabilities. Effectively, without sex buyers, the market forces that create the roles of sex traffickers and pimps will not be there. They will not. Pimps and traffickers cannot exist without the market forces being created by sex buyers. It's impossible. So I think there's so much that needs to be unpacked there. This is another article. This is something I wrote for The Hill, and I'll also just share that with you guys, Katerina. Very, very briefly, another argument that you would often hear is this idea of, well, you know, I know this college girl, 19-year-old, makes so much money on OnlyFans, or I know this one woman that's been in prostitution for decades and she has no complaints and she loves it. And, you know, so I think the retort there is the following. We're not talking about the individual person's choices, or we're not critiquing those outliers, or, you know, you could make an argument, well, this is far more prevalent that you realize, well, okay, we don't have you know, a statement on those individual cases, the one with all of these rosy circumstances. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about the system of prostitution. Now, here I'm talking about the trafficking complex system. This is a trafficking complex system. I'm just using these systems to show, kind of qualify what we talk about in terms of the system of prostitution. Now, it's the system of prostitution that brings with it the inequality, the harm, etc. And it's a system of prostitution that is embedded in the trafficking complex system, and it's the trafficking complex system that is embedded in the prostitution system. It is impossible to distinguish between these systems. It's multiple overlapping systems, whether it's demand, whether it's drugs, whether it's organized crime, you know, whether it is, you know, family members that's involved in the trafficking equation. It's the system of prostitution that brings with it physical, sexual, psychological harm, and that kind of pounces on all of these acute vulnerabilities and adverse childhood experiences. All of these manifold parts are the constellation that builds the system of prostitution and the trafficking system that's part of it. So yeah, well, you could make an argument for the OnlyFans university student, but that student is still part of the system. Harm may not yet have come her way as an individual part in a behemoth of a system, but it eventually will. And the system is what consumes, and it's a system that harms. So I think that it's always important to talk about the system of prostitution instead of these individual cases of individual choice, for whatever that means, about, you know, being part of the sex trade. Here's another example to the left. These are cases that has been documented over a period of 10 years. These are all court cases. Now, you know, those are the share of victims, and where in the sex trade they have been located. Now, if you look at that, that's really interesting. The victims of trafficking, these are all trafficking cases, right? That's been successfully prosecuted through courts in several countries. 11% of those trafficking victims, you know, the locations was the street. 10% was legal brothels. 9% was unofficial brothels. Strip clubs was 10%. Bars was 14%. Massage parlors, 9%. And if you look at these numbers, you cannot but just kind of smirk at the idea that prostitution, or sex work, as they call it, exists in its own private universe, exists from, you know, separate from the private universe of sex trafficking. These numbers and these themes clearly show how they intersect and how they overlap. Okay, let's talk about terminology. I'm not sure if you have seen Reem El-Salem's report. Katerina, you familiar with Reem El-Salem's report? Yeah, I will send all of these to you. It's a critical read on prostitution and violence against women and girls. But basically, just talking about, you know, the terms sex work, and, you know, Reem also talks about the term prostitution system that reflects, you know, the findings that prostitution is intrinsically linked to different forms of violence. Yeah, the special rapporteur also does not use the term sex work or sex worker in the report. And she says there are a number of organizations and individuals stated in their view the aforementioned terms were more appropriate as the aforementioned terms that's talking about the system of prostitution earlier in the report. And they underlined that sex work was was a legitimate, she's basically making the argument that commentators were more aligned to the term system of prostitution because the term sex work and sex worker basically dislodged from reality. And here, the special rapporteur uses the terms prostituted women and girls rather than sex worker in recognition of the scale of the harm experienced and the impairment of the fundamental rights to the protection, assistance, compensation, and reparations. So basically dispelling this notion that sex work is work, and Reem has really kind of beautifully dispelled this idea that prostitution is harmless. So please do read that report. Here's another one. The Home Affairs Committee in the UK it's a very prominent committee, and they made it very clear to ensure that the severity of sexual exploitation is recognized. The Home Office and law enforcement should refrain from using the term sex work. Fundamentally, it comes down to the obfuscation of harm, because if you apply that lens of sex work, you will, not likely or probably, you will miss countless victims of sex trafficking because of this lens. It's kind of this clinical, kind of sugar-coated lens that you apply. You will miss victims. Victims of sex trafficking, both adult and children, will fall through the cracks if your government agencies, if your law enforcement officials philosophically uses the term sex work, because it diminishes and it basically cancels the implicit harms in the sex trade. So I think these are very prominent documents. These statements that came out from Canada, from France, the German Chancellor, I think early in the year also really questioned what is happening in Germany. Some interesting statements. I do think that there's a sleeping giant of common sense, Katerina, that's busy waking up and saying these fleeting promises of prostitution and frankly these lies, where a lot of academia and the ivory academia has been implicit with for way too long. It's time to really demystify, expose, and ultimately hold people accountable for what is being proffered. Because whatever you are proffering and claiming, it has real world implications. Even journals, there are some journals and publishers that needs to be held accountable. How is it possible that you publish a research and enabling the larger sexual exploitation marketplace by this kind of studies that's either methodologically flawed or it goes against the very grain of international human rights law and international human trafficking law. So we should hold people accountable for this. I'm just going to be very brief about this, but this is a former colleague of mine, and the Shannon study. Whenever you hear researchers, lobby groups that calls for the full decrim of prostitution, even UN documents, you are very likely to come across the Shannon et al. Study, kind of entitled "Its Global Epidemiology of HIV Among Female Sex Workers." Now, that study is at the core of so many arguments that calls for the full decrim. And it's a probably the most widely cited study in the domain of sex work and HIV, etc. So what Mike Shively did, he spent a couple of years to follow up on the methodology. He read all of the papers that has been cited in this study. He reviewed all 302 sources cited in the Shannon study, and he also reviewed more than 300 additional sources from disciplines, including public health, criminal justice, law, economics, etc., to you know, to critique what this Shannon study claimed. And basically, what the Shannon study comes down to is that, you know, they make a lot of grave in error assumptions about the effects of decriminalization of sex work. So their work was based on a simulation on the assumption that decriminalization will immediately and permanently produce all of the following results, which in turn will collectively reduce HIV transmission. There is not a world, a unicorn world out there where any of this can happen. Logically, it is totally implausible that this could happen, you know. Like basically what they are concluding here, or the assumptions, is that once we flick the switch from the Swedish model to full decrim, immediately 0% violence towards sex workers, 0% harassment, 100% access to prevention and treatment, 100% access to safe workplaces, etc. So the assumptions in this study and the fact that it went through peer review and that it made it to this arguably the most widely cited study is it's really unfathomable. So what
May I just comment on that? I
Sure.
cannot stay
Yeah,
silent. You
sure.
just need to look at Germany and the model they have in Germany to realize that
Yeah.
those statements are just total lies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Katerina, do you also know that New Zealand, that's often held up as the gold standard for full decrim? Do you know that they've now spent three or four years on the tier 2 ranking of the Trafficking Persons Annual Report? And it is so clear that even the Trafficking in Persons report refers to the legal environment. Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but please read the New Zealand Trafficking in Persons report 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. I'm not sure if the same language has been used this year, but they talk about the legal environment that really creates a very, very difficult situation for police to actually go into these brothels and identify sex trafficking victims. So traffickers, pimps, runs amok in these brothels. And because there's no legal standing for the police to go in, unless there is clearly a trafficking matter, then they can't. And it is so clear, and the commentary in the Trafficking in Persons report is an absolute, the New Zealand Trafficking in Persons report is an absolute indictment on the notion that full decrim works. It doesn't. Now, the Trafficking Persons report, you need to note, it doesn't comment on issues of full decrim. It's a trafficking report. So they very diplomatically and politically, they don't veer into the politics around prostitution. But what is so clear in the report is that women and children that's being sex trafficked in the New Zealand sex trade, that is fully decriminalized, is vastly undercounted. Vastly undercounted. Just read the New Zealand Trafficking Persons report. But basically, just to conclude on some of Mike Shively's findings here is that you know, these groups, they make these huge statements about legal reform and criminal justice reform that needs to happen that would decriminalize men purchasing sexual access. But none of they don't even cite criminal justice research. So key input is criminal justice policy change, but there is no examination of the criminal justice literature. So what we see in a lot of these studies is cherry picking, and it's just bad research. And the fact that these researchers and the fact that the studies have been regurgitated to keep the full decrim issue at the top of the ladder is really problematic. And I think people are waking up, and I think there's an overdose of common sense out there. And there is a sleeping giant of common sense that's busy waking up. This is not going to continue unabated anymore. People are waking up all around the world, and we are saying no more. not on our watch. We are not going to tolerate this happening, and we are going to start exposing. We're going to start showing. And I think at the front end of this movement are survivors of sex trafficking. People, women, children with lived experiences, and say, no, this was not my experience. Your research study and the rosy picture that you paint about sex buyers that could become allies of the sex trade and help us reduce harm, that's a lie. It doesn't work. It will never work. So I think I'm encouraged and I'm hopeful that these things will begin to, increasingly come to the forefront and be exposed. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. We did do a 3-year study, Katarina, but these are some of the themes that we can, and this was not a small study. What we did, it's a demand reduction study, where we looked at all the states here in the United States that used demand reduction tactics. Now we've documented. So to your police in Finland, I would love to come and speak with them and show them this research we did. There's actually 15 different tactics that they should be using, and that is coherent and in harmony with international human rights law that could and that should be used to go after sex buyers. So before we go to the issue of sex buyers, there was just very clear themes about the nature of the sex trade that came out in this research that we did. Right in the center, prostitution and sex trafficking seamlessly overlaps. It's not a victimless crime, prostitution. The growth of the online sex trade definitely has outpaced law enforcement's ability to respond. And a lot of this has moved, have moved online, but there's also in some jurisdictions, there is a resurgence of street prostitution. So these are thematically on the issue of prostitution that we find. What we also found in system of prostitution is, these are just some of the crimes that we found in system of prostitution. And one thing that is massively escalating is the issue of CSAM, child sexual abuse material, or some countries still use the word child pornography. Implicit in so many of these harms that we've documented, but other harms include just assault, robbery, murder, rape, violence, and it's just crazy the different harms that a normalized system of prostitution brings with it. And these are not, some of these, in most of these states, the overwhelming majority of, states in the United States, prostitution is either criminalized or it's kind of partially criminalized. And notwithstanding, we still see all of these harms in the sex trade. So again, there's no way, no law will ever make prostitution safe. It is impossible. I'm not going to go too much. These are just some of the work I've done over the years, some of the cases that has featured in the media. But I just want to quickly skip here. I know we've probably run out of time, but just a little bit of insight in terms of 2 case studies very briefly. This is the one when we see a trafficking case, and you hear, and I would argue this is probably relevant to every country in the world. As I said, I've seen the inner workings of the sex trade as, I've personally arrested and done interviews with both, in an undercover role, but obviously also with sentenced traffickers. And this is so consistent with this is the research I've done. It's a USAID study I did, but it's so consistent with my own experiences in the police and obviously trafficking interviews, etc. So very often when you see a trafficking case, you have these 3 victims that testified. They went through the whole criminal justice system, but there's an entire universe of people that that's never been identified. And in both of these cases, this case and the next one, these were brothels. These were usual brothels. And I'm using the word usual, or these are just brothels that's operating in neighborhoods that lobby groups would argue, or that the sex work community would argue, well, we need to decriminalize this. And people from the outside they just got so used to these brothels in their community. And I've seen over the years, Katerina, how some of these groups go into these brothels and they hand out condoms and lubricants and, gift bags. But in that very, very same brothel, trafficking is happening. So what I still can't wrap my head around is how on earth do you go into these places and you do not see the red flags? It goes beyond my kind of imagination. I have a few very strong opinions, and I will not be sharing them here. But so here is the undercounting of victims of trafficking. This is just one of the cases where where I was involved in, where children and women were kept at the basement of this floor, and in pornography is always part of the ecosystem. We've also done research on the link between sex trafficking and pornography, and the link between demand, pornography, and sex trafficking. That fact sheet we'll publish before the end of the year, and I will share that with you. Here's one more example: 6 victims who testified, and these are the people that we don't see. And again, another brothel that in today's terms people would call for, well, these brothels should be legalized, Again, it's impossible to delineate between men's demand for commercial sex and men's demand for sex trafficking victim. It's impossible. So just to make that clear. I'm not going to go too much into all of the recommendations, and I will share several documents with you guys, Katerina. I just want to quickly check here. I think this is done, but I do think that sex bias is the elephant in the room. As soon as and I think this is what we need to do. I think we need to be very careful. And we as an organization, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, we argue strongly that those the selling, those on the supply side, the selling of sex, women, people in prostitution, that laws that criminalizes the person should be removed. So we are entirely, and this is all based on evidence and best practices, that we should be paving off-ramps out of the system of prostitution instead of paving more on-ramps into it. And paving off-ramps out of it is really part of that would be removing laws that punish and that criminalize women in prostitution. We also advocate for vacature, laws that bring about a situation where historical convictions for prostitution-related crimes are removed, so that a new life is really possible for people exiting. But conversely, we should come down hard on the issue of demand and sex bias. And this is just an interesting concluding comment by research. It says the levels of crime and violence disclosed by most men who had sex with a woman in prostitution suggest a preference for an unregulated world. The decriminalization of sex work, therefore, would be unlikely to make much difference for this particular group of dangerous men. And these are the same researchers that has advocated for, or ventilated the idea of decriminalization of the sex trade. Again, final comment: it is impossible to make the sex trade safe, and a lot of problematic research out there. And yeah, we're looking forward to sharing that with you, Katerina. So I'm going to end here. I know that there's a couple of slides and even videos that I skipped, but I'll make available whatever I can after this call. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think I'll end this official part here.